I was just teasing you so that once you're here we can start. Well, the crisis in Ukraine resonates certainly, especially in the Balkans. It has a special resonance in the Balkans, but we are not the only region in the world that is attuned now to these Cold War echoes from Kiev. And while no one wants a new Cold War, I'm sure people want a new hot one even less. So I think the subject we are going to be addressing here today is what are the history lessons that require relearning with the crisis in Ukraine and the winds of the new Cold War. And I think we are very fortunate to have with us here today His Excellency Ambassador Lamberto Zannier. He is the Secretary General of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. He also served as United Nations Special Representative and the head of UNMIK in Kosovo from June 2008 to 2011. And Ambassador Zannier has spent more than 30 years in the Italian Foreign Service, and he served in many countries. He has mainly specialized in security affairs and has authored many publications on these issues, and he also has a PhD in international law. Thank you for being with us. It is just as much a pleasure and an honor for me to introduce and welcome Professor Jeffrey Sachs. He's from Columbia University. He's the director of the Earth Institute. He runs a lot of institutions. He's also a special advisor to Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on the Millennium Development Goals. He's the director of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Professor Sachs is a member of the CIRSD Board of Advisors, and we're very happy to have him with us. And I am pleased to be able to introduce Ms. Natalia Narochnitskaya. She's a Russian politician, historian, and diplomat. She's the president of the Foundation for Historical Outlook in Moscow. She was a member of the State Duma of the Russian Federation from 2003 to 2007. She was also the vice chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, chairman of the Committee for the Study and Practice and Implementation of Human Rights and Civil Liberties, and a member of the Russian delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council on Europe. She also has a doctorate in history. She is an author of several works about Russian history, but one of these works has been translated into Serbian and has received great acclaim in Belgrade. And from 2008, Mrs. Narochnitskaya has been the director of the Paris office of the Russian Institute of Democracy and Cooperation. It is also my privilege to introduce Professor Nina Khrushcheva. She is an associate professor in the graduate program of international affairs at the New School in New York and a senior fellow of the World Policy Institute. Ms. Khrushcheva has obtained a degree from Moscow State University and a PhD in comparative literature from Princeton University. She has published a lot on issues that interest us today, and she is also an author of 2 noted books, and I will especially mention The Lost Khrushchev, A Journey into the Gulag of the Russian Mind. Ms. Khrushcheva is also an editor, and she takes part in the Project Syndicate Network. And the idea today is to give each one of our speakers a chance to present their views, maybe 5 to 10 minutes, and then we will proceed with questions and parallels and analogies that I'm sure everyone is waiting for. Ambassador Zannier, please.
Thank you. I will perhaps start by presenting a couple of personal perspectives, so especially on the origins of this crisis, from two very special OSCE-related angles. The first is the fact that Ukraine had the chairmanship of the OSCE last year. So I was regularly in Kiev. I met a number of times with the president. I went to Crimea a number of times. And I saw very closely the process leading up to Vilnius and the crisis, of course. And we had a ministerial in December in Kiev, where a number of ministers were there, but where the attention was almost more on what was going on outside the conference room than to the discussions, inside. The second angle, also related to the OSCE, is the debate we have on the organization, looking, and this is something that Serbia will inherit as the chairmanship next year, the debate on what we call Helsinki plus 40, where there is the idea and the strategy is to try to move towards a common security space, as we call it, from Vancouver to Vladivostok, something that was designed in Astana, but something that ended up clashing against the notion of different, in fact, spheres within the organization, possibly colliding with each other. So on the first point, what I saw last year was a genuine determination of Ukrainian leadership to engage more deeply with the European Union. I met with Commissioner Füle a number of times. I was always encouraged by the Ukrainian leadership to look and also to present, in a way, the work that Ukraine was doing within the OSCE as a sign of the genuine will of Ukraine to move towards the European Union. I never detected one of the things we are seeing now, which is the difference of opinions or different attitudes within Ukraine vis-à-vis the European perspective that we see now as one of the divisive elements in the Ukrainian society. Something I remember at least to a certain extent from 2004, when I was also in Ukraine in a different context, but during the Orange Revolution, because I was at the time head of the Conflict Prevention Center of the OSCE, and I saw the demonstrations. I remember demonstrations from the people from Donetsk coming up, led by Yanukovych, flying, however, Ukrainian flags, not Russian flags at the time, which is an interesting difference with some of the things we see in the streets today. Yanukovych, seems to me, was, in respect of the European perspective, a kind of a reassurance or unifying element in a way. But of course, the way he was presenting the steps in deepening cooperation of Ukraine with the European Union was always presented in a very careful and balanced manner, saying this will go ahead with a continuation of a strong cooperation with Russia. I heard a number of times statements on the compatibility and full compatibility of the deep comprehensive free trade area with the customs union, which often were denied by people in Brussels and perhaps even by people in Moscow. So Ukraine ended up at some point, and Yanukovych personally ended up in a situation when he realized that these assumptions that working on both elements and proceeding on the two tracks in parallel, in fact, didn't have enough buy-in by the actors concerned. And then when this was coupled with the problems that he had on the economy, the energy, and he needed the support that had become very clearly something extremely urgent and dramatic, then at that point he became vulnerable, and then he had to obviously change the line, the Vilnius drama, and the people in the streets, and that's where the story began. Also the handling of the Maidan was in a way the source of the next problem, because it then led to a messy conclusion, to the ousting of the president through a process that certainly was not clean in a way, divisive internally, divisive externally. So what we see today in Ukraine is a situation that suffers from deep division on the external side and deep divisions internally that have resulted also in the difficult situations on the ground on the security side. The spheres of influence we see, or however we want to call them, we see now the recent signing of the agreement on the Eurasian Union, and Russia is very vocal within the OSCE in presenting the new set of tools that will enhance cooperation and improve the situation in the Eurasian area, from the CSTO to the role of the CIS and the customs union, now the economic union, etc. So there is a clear process developing in that area that seems to be coming to clash with a process that is Eurocentric, the neighborhood and the role of the European Union vis-à-vis its own neighboring countries. If you look at Ukraine, following the developments and with the disappearance of Yanukovych and with the appearance of a government that is seen as in parts of the countries as a government that is very far, and with the increasing political polarization, there is a risk of lines and dividing lines appearing right across Ukraine. So this is one of the issues we are dealing with, and this is where we feel that we need to intervene to support a process of political engagement, a process of dialogue, a process of clarification, giving a platform for everybody to engage on, and to find those key elements that would allow for a reversal of the dynamics that are now problematic. So this is how, in very few words, I would introduce from my perspective the problem. In terms of addressing it from an OSCE perspective, we felt that because of the multiplicity of issues that we have on the table, we need to really use a very large set of tools. So we have the monitors on the ground. What happened as a result of the situation is that there are very different stories, very different interpretations of what is happening on the ground. And these are being amplified, and this alone is creating deeper divisions within the society. So strong polarization within the society. So having people on the ground that report back on what they see and try to rectify perceptions that may be partisan, I think is an important part of this. And the very presence of internationals there should act as an element of at least to a certain extent, of stabilization. Supporting political processes. The dialogue and the national dialogue now mediated by two former presidents, Kuchma and Kravchuk, I think is very important, needs to be supported, needs to be continued. We are there to help and to assist the Ukrainians, but there has to be a Ukrainian ownership for this. It is important that they go ahead and they take it upon themselves to carry it forward. They shouldn't be limited in their ability to engage with all relevant sides. And the government will be one of the participants in this process. It shouldn't really drive it. It should be driven by the two institutional figures on their own merit, and we as international community should support. Elections, we have been, I think the OSCE has set up the largest monitoring observation election in the history of the organization. We brought more than 1,000 people. So it is important to continue supporting political democratic processes in Ukraine. We and others are supporting actually it's mainly the Council of Europe and the Venice Commission, the constitutional reform. That will be a very important process. At some point there should be elections, parliamentary elections. It's important also to restore the centrality of the Rada, of the parliament. It seems to me that the Rada has lost some of its connections with the constituencies, especially in the east. So there will be at some point a need to reconnect. So there is, I think there is a complicated political agenda, difficult role for the international community, but the space is there. Situation on the ground is certainly not encouraging. And that's one of the areas on which we need to work to turn the process from one where the violence is prevailing to one where we go back to a political track.
Thank you. Then, Ms. Narochnitskaya, you were next. Thank you.
Well, it is not very difficult. It's not very easy for me with the name sounding a little bit Polish, and my grandmother on father's line bore the name Zakrzewska. With my father's all generations of ancestors born in Ukraine, and my father graduating from Kyiv University in the 30s, speaking Russian, Ukrainian, German, French, English, to speak about this dramatic issue. But of course, I think to understand and to perceive, not just to learn some new information, but to perceive the essence of the dramatic processes, you have to go from the cliches of globalization, from this fight between the last vestiges of totalitarianism and the new democratic order, which seems for us who were studying the scientific communism and materialism sounds the same as when we were asked what is the main essence of our epoch, and we were supposed to answer the transition from capitalism to socialism. So now it's the transition from totalitarianism to democracy. But this blind paradigm just blocks us from understanding the processes which have roots both in interethnic, cultural, historical, religious, geopolitical, and other aspects of universal history, especially in such place which is adjacent to the area which caused wars over control since Punit wars between Carthage and Rome, that is the Mediterranean and Black Sea region. And it's the Eastern question that gave its aspects to the World War I that we have been discussing for several days already, and also reflected in the Second World War geopolitical aspirations of actors concerned, and it is again revealing its aspects after the collapse of Soviet Union. This is also the result of the Bolshevist doctrinal attempt to design a new country with federalized regions, disregarding the natural borders of peoples assembled through history to these big countries. Yugoslavia has suffered the same way. What was Bosnia and Herzegovina? That was artificial merge of people and areas who could not live together without forceful control over it, although it's ethnically the same ethnic entity, but so different in its aspirations and geopolitical orientation. So what is Ukraine of today's? And this is also the politics of the United States and of Russia, and the collapse of the ideas and project launched after the collapse of Soviet Union. That was the project of unipolar world. Maybe the American rocket is still orbiting sun according to the correct calculations, but they miscalculated the orbits of other actors of international and history life, and that is that the world is changing so rapidly, and the dynamics of international development and even historical drive and energy moved irreversibly to the east, and I think we must also take that into account. And Russia has not died. It assembled itself and it started speaking with independent voice. And it showed first in Munich speech, then with the recognition of Ossetia and Abkhazia, that her historical, hereditary, national, vital and critical defense interests are more important to her and her people and the opinion of her own people than the lenient encouragement of Big Brother like Yeltsin was treated with in the previous period. So those experts in the West who knew very well and who know very well the Soviet Union, the Russian history, they warned their respective government, both in France, for instance, Chevenman and also Stephen Cohen, who now is labeled as some rogue person. They warned that the only way to retain Ukraine is post-Soviet borders was to keep it neutral, where neither east of Ukraine nor west of Ukraine try to impose on each other one-sided orientation. Russia has proven through 20 years that it, well, not very happy with it, but still was ready to be satisfied with that under the condition Ukraine is not drawn into the NATO orbit, thus changing drastically all the equilibrium in the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Well, you know that both Crimean wars and First World Wars and part of the regional flank of Second World War were fought and the British engagement with Greece was just to control the strait so that they do not go into the orbits of the Soviet Union. So it's very important. What is Ukraine? I can circulate that map from the internet. This is post-Soviet Ukraine, where things that could not live together are artificially brought together. We were not disputing those borders. This is the original Ukraine, independent Kazakh Republic of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, joining Russian state in 1654. All the rest, where people were speaking Ukrainian, the language that was a branch of Old Russian, of which Russian language I'm speaking also another branch, etc., started developing in 14th century. All the rest was under Poland, Austria, and all the rest. And it's only Russian Tsars, while growing Russian Empire, took back those territories originally belonging to Kiev Rus, now joining them and giving them as present to the Ukrainian nation. The blue color, this is exactly the region that now is rebellious. This is in Novorossiya. Nobody spoke there Ukrainian, and it was not considered, it was Catherine the Great and later Tsars were having this territory. It was given by Bolsheviks after civil war to appease all nationalist sentiments of Ukrainian Bolsheviks, and now they are rebellious. Then Crimea was, not then. Then Stalin's much greater mistake than the Khrushchev's one was, I'm not at all one of those who said this, somebody else is guilty for that and that, because history is too complex, and the ideological motivation of people in the previous historical period, they formed the paradigm of thinking, which made them make decisions quite different from if they would have been made from another paradigm. But Stalin disregarded the aide-memoir of Minister Durnovo given to the Tsar Nicholas II just a few weeks before the First World War, where he warned the Tsar that there won't be any achievements in this inevitable already, unfortunately, war. Because first, we are fighting together as allies with our major geopolitical rival, Great Britain, that will see to it that nothing would be achieved, you know. And the only prize could be Galicia, because Austria-Hungary will inevitably collapse, and there will be decision over the plight of the territories of that. But in a delirium, one should not think even of having that, because Galicia, although originally one of the oldest Russian princedoms, from 1349, when Casimir the Great conquered it, that's why he was named the Great, and it's written in Wawel, Krakowi castle, where his grave is. I read it. So I thought, if you take somebody else's land, you are named in history Great. When the same lands were partitioned between Prussia, Russia and Austria, so you are a victim. Well, all borders in history, French, American, British, are designed the same way. So let us be philosophical about it. So Galicia has never shared common history with Orthodox Ukraine, and especially after the Union of Brest, that is 1596, there was a religious crusader spirit in those who started calling themselves Ukrainians. Practically up to the First World War, Ukrainian meant more than Malorossians were called the Orthodox Ukrainian, and they called themselves that way. But the Galician Uniats were calling themselves Ukrainian. They have Russophobic attitude. Their self-identification is, that's Durnovo's text, is anti-Moscovitz. So they will poison the rest of Ukraine, and Russia will become Russia Minor. So Stalin disregarded. He was more clever than Minister Durnovo and took it. Now what we are witnessing, it's exactly the Galician activists that transmitted this impetus of Russophobic, and their identification of Ukrainians now becomes anti-Russian, which is very unconstructive, because the national energy is still absorbed by searching even anthropological differences between Russians and Ukrainians. It's so, well, I have no words to describe it. You have some texts of scientific and academic chairs professing that we Russians are a mixture of Mongols, Tatars, and Ugro-Finn, and only the Ukrainians are Aryans. And real heirs to the Saint Vladimir Kiev Rus. So we have stolen, we Muscovites have stolen, and the Byzantine heritage and the Kiev history to make our ugly barbarian history a little bit more attractive. So even such things, and you read it in cahiers, papers of some chairs, etc. So that's all we see. Now, just a few words about stages of the crisis. Yanukovych was never considered and understood in Russia a pro-Russian politician, which he has never been. He was a Ukrainian clan businessman, rivaling for, you know, and the corrupted Ukrainian economic situation was also the reason of major public protest and etc. But he never read even the hundreds pages of this agreement. I know that. And when it was translated to him by insistence of Russian participants in the negotiations, when he read it, he didn't speak with anybody for 3 days. I'm sorry. He understood that the whole East Ukrainian industry, which is the only industry in the post-Soviet republics which has high technology, which is competitive, which is forming up to 2/3 of Ukrainian budget, and it has about several million of jobs there, it would collapse immediately. What about Maidan? It may be disputed whether it was from the very beginning organized or orchestrated, but certainly I admit that it was at least at the half spontaneous, and it had multifaceted presentation. There were students, there were pro-European dreaming people, because Europe still is for us, all Russians and Ukrainians, it's a phenomenon of culture. Not when we say West, we consider it as geopolitical entity like rival. When we pronounce Europe, it's a culture. It's Goethe, Schiller, it's Mozart, it's philosophers. It's something else, and we feel kin to it, if not part of it, and we certainly are. Europe just is not only Latin Europe; it's Orthodox Europe too, and both branches and experiences in history have universal price, and are precious, and only together that can make us all European and Christian civilization to sustain in the future configuration, where China, United States, and Europe only in good relations with Russia could form the third party of this triangle. But it started spontaneously. I admit that there was one episode of very cruel behavior on the part of militia there. But in January, Maidan totally was changed. And this is the American party, and we have absolutely undisputable evidence that have taken decision to instrumentalize Maidan, using as major weapon those almost fascist and Nazist elements of all Ukraine. They were, collecting them from all places to become a force. They are not forming the majority at all. First, it started with the Nazi torch procession in Kiev on 2nd of January with portraits of Bandera, the one and his collaborators were even appalling the Hitler soldiers by their cruelty. They are guilty in death and torture of hundreds and thousands of Poles, and both Russians and Orthodox Ukrainians. Then it started, everybody is knowing what it started. And Russia, even in November, didn't plan at all what happened afterwards. It's only after the agreement of end of February was totally trampled upon, although I know that the European leaders asked Putin to influence Yanukovych to yield and make concessions, and he did so, I'm sure, under certain guarantees. Otherwise, it's not being done in politics. In 3 days, those pieces of papers were just in the wastebasket, and it was also an insult. And we understood, Russia understood that America was sick and tired of this neutral floating of Ukraine between one orbit and another, and decided to delete it all like in computer, and to start anew the whole political orientation of Ukraine, taking it into NATO orbits together with Crimea and Sevastopol, the Russian naval and marine rampart, and also a certain constituent myth of our historical mentality. And that is why it happened what it happened. I will probably have time to develop more and give more information when asked questions. But what is going now? The only, all experts, for instance, in France, where even Le Figaro admitted the majority of comments and blogs are not sharing the same attitude the governmental line is. And even there was an editorial, a dialogue with a sociologist who was answering the question why the 85% of all comments to the articles are against American policy there and for Russia. And he answered that now there is no dilemma Europe and Russia like it used to be. There is another dilemma. Postmodernist Europe trampling upon traditional values, and traditional Europe. And Russia is now perceived by those traditionalists in France, for instance, as the only country which openly, on governmental level, declares that it defends traditional values and has sense of history, etc. That's why they are supporting. I'm not, I understand the drama of this, and for me it's a drama, while fully supporting the decisions that were the only decisions that could make Russia, have future. I also cry like King David when he was reported that about the defeat of his rebellious son Avessalom. He was just crying and saying, "Oh, Avessalom, my son," etc. But there was nothing to lose. If you only knew what kind of history has been taught in Ukrainian schools under Yanukovych too, by the way, how they interpreted the Second World War, where millions of Ukrainians fought, heroically together with Russians, never thinking of who they were, Ukrainians or Russians, sharing the cigarette and one bullet for two, etc. So there was already something. We could not let down the people in Crimea. So, just a couple of days before I came to Belgrade to this distinguished conference, and I thank you for the chance to speak so sincerely with you. Now, I had a round table in France where professor of law of Sorbonne, whom we asked to stick absolutely to the legal paradigm of issues discussed without sine ire et studio. He was developing on the dilemma between self-determination right and the principle of intangibility of borders, or territorial integrity. And he gave numerous examples how these two notions were treated in international life. He just mentioned that, for instance, there is also such principles in international law like historical rights. When people, although by chance happen to be in another state, but keep maintaining very tense ethnical, ethical, cultural mentality and other ties with their previous motherland, have right. That's why even to post-Nazi Germany was given right to take back the Saar region, where referendum was allowed, and they left France and came to, and that was accepted, because final decision is always the interest of great powers, and etc. He even mentioned that France took back Alsace and Lorraine in 1918. although it was since Bismarck, well, German, and without any referendum, exactly. So in Crimea, contrary to Kosovo, which was a real Pandora box, and our country warned that don't think it will just go away in history without consequences. They will appear, and not only on Russian, on the territory of our, motherland. I'm sure those echoes will be heard afterwards, because it was absolutely illegal and there was no right, neither self-determination, all historical rights were with Serbs and not with Kosovo. There was no referendum, although Mr. Obama, well, American schools are not like Russian schools. Even in the Soviet times, even in the Soviet times, when people probably in the West thought we were so under the Iron Curtain. In my school, for instance, we made our own translations from Schiller, and I was the only deputy in the Council of Europe who could quote ballads from Schiller and Goethe in German, contrary to all German deputies who just never even heard such names as Goethe and Schiller. So, and that is the, after an geopolitical earthquake, there are always after tremors, and they continue. If we want Ukrainian state to continue, at least in these borders that are now, the only way every wise advisor could say it's a federalization with decentralized power, so that nobody is imposing it. These people in the Novorossiya, they think and they identify themselves in Russian language, not to let them speak Russian, use it in everyday life, and not to get education. That means such trampling upon basic human rights which just annihilate an individual. For us, it's absolutely impossible. For instance, the principle of Augsburg religious peace, cuius regio eius religia, was unthinkable in Russia. Although people were subjugated by their landlords, they were whipped and even killed, etc. But to make them change face only because you are now ruled by another, that in Russia was considered an utmost crime against God's given free will, because only voluntary acceptance of Christian heritage and Christian teaching is precious. I'm trying to, it's very emotional, because of course, as I presented myself, it's very hard not to be emotional in these aspects, although I am professional international law and international relations scholar for all my life, so still I'm just I don't know who, Ukrainian or Russian intellectual, because before revolution, the ancestors of my father, they considered themselves Russian, although Ukraine has never been for them just territorial phenomenon. It was enormously precious, unique and distinct place.
Thank you, Professor Narochnitskaya. And we are now going to hear from Professor Khrushcheva.
Thank you very much. A lot to say in response to Natalia Narochnitskaya, fascinating presentation. It is indeed very emotional. I want to say, just to start with one thing, I mean, yes, American education appears, or so people say, is much worse than the Russian, the great Russian or European. I want, however, to bring to your attention that many people have studied at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Columbia University, and I'm sure in this audience there's a lot of people. In fact, Vok Jeremic, whom we respect very much and thank for being at this conference, in fact, is a graduate from Harvard. So I just immediately disclose that I am an America-centric person. I am a Russian, so I would have to wear both hats, I guess, but I guess my American hat will overweigh the Russian one, and if you do not agree with that kind of assessment, I guess we're in a free country, so we, I'm sure, can agree to disagree. So a couple of things I actually still want to respond on. I totally get your argument, but that agreement you mentioned on February 21 is actually the one that Russia didn't approve of. So that is, then Russia wanted to go back to it, but originally didn't approve, so it's hard to make an argument on that basis. Also, I actually did go to Ukraine 3 times during the protests, and I was very hard-pressed to find fascist or Bandera forces. I was on the Maidan, and I'm sure they were there, but it's not the way it was presented on by sort of Russia Today or many other sources that just running around really creating a fascist coup, so to take Kiev away from the legacy of World War II and the Slavic brothers. So that's another point that I want to make, although I'm sure when, as we all know, when revolutions are prolonged or last long enough, the fringe elements do join the revolution and ultimately can even take over. And in fact, that at some point did happen on the Maidan. Not that they take over, but there were certainly fringe elements there. But the same then can be actually reversed and be said about Donetsk, because there's a lot of obviously very violent fringe elements that now claim that they're creating an independent force. And I would like to take Vladimir Putin at his word when he says he has nothing to do with that, because then actually this kind of balance certainly can be cited. Something that you said that I actually find very interesting and very dangerous, and amazingly enough, this is actually part of what I was going to say. Something that you said that all this kind of high-level conversation or hypothetical conversation, I guess, about globalization and from totalitarianism, we get to democracy, all this is less important than for Vladimir Putin than the sort of the integrity of the original territory that Russia claimed. I'm sorry, I'm paraphrasing, but something to the point. And more important, that some hypothetical or not even so hypothetical international institutions. So the view of the Russians is more important than international laws. And actually, that's something that I find monumentally dangerous, as something that I want to address. I keep thinking about the first day of this conference, which was really an eye-opener, an amazing eye-opener, because we talk about powers that dupe each other, that they use each other, and some are forgiven. It's not really necessarily so different from today, and not even so shocking. So, for example, Vladimir Putin views the United States as something, as a power that holds him to the unfair standards, but by itself can do whatever it wants to do. And in some ways, I think, like Germany in World War I, Putin thinks in Ukraine he's fighting a defensive war. I must be very honest with you, I rarely agree with Vladimir Putin. But here I do, not on the defensive war, but on the view that America has a lot of hubris, no offense. And my students at the New School always say, my foreign students at the New School always say to my American students that if you're an American, you always think that you're better than everybody else, even if you think you're not better than everybody else. So it is true that US lecturing on moral standing towards anybody who is not them often gets very infuriating, especially in the last 15 years. Quite annoying, also because of this incredible open mediascape that has now been created. So I do see that sometimes it can get testy, but still there are a world with respected international institutions, and even those who think they're better than anybody else, for the most part, do follow those laws. And as I mentioned, America-centric. So for the West inconsistence, it's actually great that you said Europe is one thing and West is the other thing, because it's really such a good line. So for all the West inconsistency and even hypocrisy since World War II, for the most part, we lived in the world of reasonable comfort and civility. And I know many countries would say it's not the case, but I look at that in a larger perspective. And we lived not in nationalistic fever, a militant rejection of illegal economic institutions. So basically, everybody benefits from the United States on a larger scale, including, by the way, is Vladimir Putin, because he, as we know very well, does not live or does not exercise a very rigid planned economy. I mean, that country does not live in a planned economy, but instead, actually, it's quite outrageous form of capitalism. So here you go. That's your America. So with the latest events in Ukraine, when Putin decided to stand up to this world order that was created and has existed for, 50, 60 years, so in today's political discourse, indeed, he's larger than life. I mean, yesterday was all about history, and yet Putin and Russia and Ukraine would come up at all times. And what I find really interesting that in fact, even those who don't like him actually like him or fascinated by him. For example, it is remarkable to listen to the American conservatives today is that he's a strong leader, even if they hate what he's doing. And for many West European liberals, which is an entirely different clan, he's very despicable. But I was just in various European countries, including Vienna, which is kind of a centrist, very central European discourse. The U.S., with its grandstanding and lack of diplomacy, is seen as something that exasperates the crisis. So it's interesting that Vuk posed the question for us, is it the new Cold War? So what I'd like to pose is that probably not, and I try to briefly explain why. First of all, the Western camp, despite what the Washington tells us today, is in some bit of disarray, and it doesn't bode well for the world where now all can do supposedly or decide to break international norms because America can, or if America can, one can't they. George Kennan, who was a great mentor of mine, I was very lucky to be his last research assistant at Princeton, he spoke about this kind of American predicament very eloquently in the 90s, and he even wrote an article in Foreign Affairs which was called On American Principles, and he was addressing the 90s, which is the Yugoslavian crisis, the disintegration, and the West and U.S. involvement. And what he said is that if the United States doesn't uphold to its own moral standards, it doesn't fit to world leadership. So he said it already then in 1995. No country is perfect, as they say. Democracy is just the best of all the very imperfect forms of government. So here we are. On the other side of the problem with the Cold War, I guess analogy, it doesn't have problems because you can make analogs of everything to everything, but Cold War comparison, I guess, that also Russia still doesn't have a pact. I mean, it needs to have a Warsaw Pact or needs to have some sort of a bloc to deal with, and it is entirely possible that that bloc will appear or is appearing quite soon. I mean, there's a deal with China, and I call it the possible values pact, because as you know, Russia has declared conservative values and is going to stand for conservative values around the world now. So it may include China, Iran, Egypt, Syria. You mentioned the newly signed Eurasian Union agreement. I did watch it on TV. It was kind of a sad, very sad, lonely threesome because other countries didn't join yet. But we'll see. What it is, if it's not the Cold War, so what it is. And I think by continuing to press Ukraine, Putin pushes the world into something much more dangerous from my point of view. The states and one another can actually, if they're willing to go to the brink, and international norms and institutions no longer, or their national interests are more important than any international laws and institutions, then we can assume that the use of nuclear weapons becomes a very reasonable alternative, which something that neither United States nor the Soviet leaders ever contemplated, at least after the existential experience of 1962. And, you know, people cite their relatives here at the conference. There have been numerous citing of relatives, so I have to, you know, say that my predecessor, my grandfather Nikita Khrushchev, in 1962 actually did make an attempt to break international laws with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Jeffrey Sachs mentioned it last night, but then both sides actually kind of backed off and decided that nuclear weapons should be only used as deterrent to a military conflict and nothing else. But the logic, when I'm following the logic of Putin's new posturing, it suggests that this threat of those weapons could become a valuable strategy. One sign that the conversation may have already begun is that U.S. is already alleging that Russia is cheating on a 1987 nuclear arms agreement. Those of you who follow the Eurasian Union agreement, you did notice that Kazakhstan already, you know, they immediately went into a plan of having sort of participating in building Russian nuclear. Russia is building them a nuclear plant. Then Iran is going to get 8 new reactors apparently. So we are really in a new nuclear era of some sort. And a good example is Ukraine of 1994, when it gave up nuclear weapons for security. You know, nobody wants to follow that example. Who is going to disarm when things like the Ukrainian crisis can unfold? So what really is I find dangerous. There's a lot to say, and I don't want to take your time too much. But what I find very interesting, once again, from the first panel, from the first day of the conference, is the panelist assessment of Russia drivers 100 years ago. It's security, interest, and identity. And I find it fascinating that it's as relevant today as it was 100 years ago. So Russia's aim is still to be seen as a great power, not as a regional power that Barack Obama recently dismissed Vladimir Putin as being. But I also think it goes more than just the imperial ambitions of Putin. And it does sound very trite to talk about the imperial ambitions, although they do exist. But you know, what do these words really say? I also think that Putin should be concerned about the preservation of his rule and for his own physical security. You know, Libya's Gaddafi, Iraq's Saddam Hussein, really good examples of things that can happen when autocratic regimes go over the top. I also can cite the example of Lavrentiy Beria, the notorious NKVD chief, who perfected the system of oppression, and then that system brutally swallowed him after Stalin's death in 1953. I did follow Russian reports on Maidan and Kiev, and it does seem overwhelmingly negative in terms of what Kiev has done and what they're aspiring to, and they're called fascists and thugs and whatnot. And I really think that that kind of propaganda formula, not that they were not fascists and thugs in that movement, but portraying them overwhelmingly, I think, is entirely wrong. But that actually cemented the opinion that that Russia has the just leader and Ukraine is actually in the wrong. So the revolt was incredibly discredited in the eyes of the Russian people. Putin's speech on May 18th kind of delivered the sort of the final reasoning for the annexation. I have to say, was very proud. Khrushchev was front and center as the guilty party of giving Crimea to Ukraine in 1954. None of what Vladimir Putin said, in fact, was correct, but nonetheless, I think it was, and I'm very grateful for Natalia Narochnitskaya saying that looking for guilty parties is really not a viable alternative to study history, but, you know, we all need a bad guy. So I am accepting the fact that Khrushchev is a bad guy, and, you know, now the peninsula is returned to the motherland. Yay, all very good. I'm sure Khrushchev would have approved, by the way. So Putin really presents himself in an interesting kind of gatherer of historical Russian lands, of uniter of Russian lands, and that can secure his power for life. And from where I stand, I think that that is one of his agendas and one of his reasoning, that actually makes it more dangerous, because if we have somebody like that in the Kremlin that is ready to redraw international borders, if he chooses to redraw them further, he may not blink before using Russia's nuclear arsenal. And given the country's relatively weak conventional army, it's probably the bluff that he may be willing to take. Once again, from yesterday's very illuminating panels, in order to retain or obtain power, great powers need to fight wars one way or another. So, you know, it is entirely possible. And in some ways, actually, that bluff is not even very wrong, because when the Ukraine crisis was developing, the United States, NATO immediately said that there was no military intervention, there is no such option. And we can argue, and they argue, that Ukraine is not a NATO member, although there was a Budapest Agreement of 1994. But because Russia is a nuclear power, who is going to fight this way? You know, there are a lot of Russian-speaking populations. I mean, my favorite resort, and many Russians' favorite resort, is in Latvia. It's called Jūrmala. It's on the Baltic Sea. It's fantastic. There's a lot of Russian-speaking people. And what if, you know, somebody decides that there's going to be a referendum there, and they will decide to take over? There would be a Crimea on the Baltic Sea. Latvia is a NATO country. Would NATO go and defend it? I mean, this is a hypothetical scenario, but we do need to think about those. The reason I sort of posed all this is that I do believe that we are in international relations after Kennan, after George Kennan, when we're really entering, and, you know, by the way, his Axe article, The Containment Theory, was 1946, which is exactly after World War II. So we're entering a sort of new era with a much greater volatility, I believe, and sort of a great danger that really has not been used by kind of that kind of whim of a will was not used after World War II, excluding the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm actually struck by how as different as Putin and Khrushchev may seem. In some ways, their reactions are similar, because they are very concerned with the balance of power. If somebody does something, I mean, if one side does something, another side should be doing something. For example, the Cuban Missile Crisis. By the way, Jeff Sachs wrote an amazing book on the Cuban Missile Crisis and Kennedy-Khrushchev relations. The Cuban Missile Crisis was largely driven, and many other things, but largely driven by the fact that Khrushchev was just incensed that the United States would have missiles in Turkey. So that is very close to the Soviet border. But why the Soviet Union would not have missiles in Cuba? Why can't we have that in Cuba? So in some ways, I think Crimea is Putin's own Monroe Doctrine to that stand. But I think certainly differentiates them is that Khrushchev was not a determined leader. He was able to back off. I think Putin is a very determined leader, and to prove his power, once he calls the bluff, he's not going to back off, and I think that really makes it very dangerous for us. And I want to go back to my point on the strong leader, Putin's strong leader, and everybody is in adoration. I mean, not in adoration with a negative or positive, but still sort of like, oh, look at him, he's so strong. Actually, I don't think any of this makes Putin a strong leader, and I can tell you why. In political theories, It is a very strong belief that weak states have weak liberties. Only weak states have weak liberties. And if it is a weak politician who needs to prove his might through force. Thank you very much.
Just a few words about Khrushchev. For me, Khrushchev is a good guy because my father was brother of the enemy of the people under Stalin regime, although already renowned historian, etc. So it's an irony of history. And he expected to be arrested shortly before Stalin's death. So he praised the Khrushchevian attitude with regard to this end of repressions, etc. But of course, Khrushchev, as any other human being, was not without errors, miscalculations, short-sightedness, etc. Thank you.
Oh, of course. He was a Soviet despot. I mean, yeah.
Professor Sachs, tell us, is this a Cold War rivalry? And if it is not, why is the rhetoric so similar? And Nina just used the word propaganda, and I was struck by how we speak of American. Oh, I'm sorry. I was saying that if we're speaking of propaganda and the way the rhetoric is so similar to the Cold War rhetoric, why is it that we always, for example, we've just heard of American hubris and of Russian imperial ambition, and I could find similar comparisons on the other side as well. So could you please comment on that?
Thank you very much. What a fascinating discussion. And I feel, as an American, we can't remember anything about history at all. And here, nobody forgets anything. So it's absolutely remarkable to have 1,000 years of history fully in mind. And it's very impressive, by the way. It's been a very, very rich discussion. I'm also an economist, which is a very strange breed of thinkers. And it has many demerits, but it also has a couple of merits, which I just want to describe briefly as a prelude to this. Economists, since Adam Smith, have a missing gene about about nations and about borders, because the theme of so much of economics is that borders are artificial, and it is trade, markets, and global that gives prosperity. And I basically believe that also. So I have a missing gene, I know, in being able to think in strong national terms. Because I really believe that it's when we have open, connected borders and international life that people achieve what they aim to achieve in prosperity. That's not the whole story of life by any means. There is identity, there's culture, there's people's feelings, beliefs, religion, language. I don't want to minimize that. But from an economic point of view, so much of this is self-destructive, because when we divide rather than unify, we almost inevitably crush economic opportunities rather than create economic opportunities. And this comes to a lesson that we haven't talked about of World War I that I want to bring into this discussion about Ukraine, and that is the post-World War I. Maybe it was talked about actually yesterday. I missed it, but I haven't heard it referred to, so I'm going to mention it. Of course, the end of World War I is famous for having made a mess of the post-World War I economy, having created the reparations burden on Germany, having created a breakdown, actually, of what had been spreading trade through Europe and what became completely parcelized and divided Europe, which was a cause of the economic crisis of the 1920s and the Depression and the rise of Hitler to power in the 1930s with the economic disaster. And of course, John Maynard Keynes became famous justly for having written in 1919 in The Economic Consequences of the Peace, the basic insight, which has been disputed but is basically right and remains, that a harsh peace after World War I was a risk of creating a new harsh political environment that could give rise to a regrowth of war. And that unfortunately proved to be the case. So let me fast forward 75 years to the end of the communist period, where I picked up the story personally in 1989. I was asked by the Polish Solidarity movement, and I'm going in 3 days to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the first partially free election in this region, which was June 4th, 1989. I was asked by Solidarity to help them devise an economic strategy. And I was given one sentence as the assignment from Jacek Kuran, who asked me to write this document, which I did. He also asked me unfairly to write it overnight in one night, which I also did. And that was the advantage of having had several Harvard all-nighters. Maybe the one training I got that paid off. But he said the first line should be, "This is an economic plan to return to Europe." So the vision of Solidarity was to break the artificial divide of 1945 and to try to create a unified Europe. And I wrote a plan that said, make trade open almost immediately, make the currency convertible, and I said Poland should rejoin Europe, which was then the European Community. I wrote in the document within 5 years, or at the end of 5 years. It took 15 years at the end. But the idea was a quick return to Europe. And I can tell you something very particular, which was that everything I suggested, how to stabilize the currency, emergency funding, the IMF and the US government followed almost to the letter and almost instantaneously. And I thought, gee, that's good. This is how it should be. This is going to be the difference of 1919 and 1989. And then I came here, and Mr. Markovic asked me to help end the Yugoslav hyperinflation. And I looked at the data and I said, you know, there is a way to do this. I have an idea. And actually, I had a good idea, which could have worked. And Mr. Markovic made a plan, as many of you will recall, and it went into effect. And then there was no response from the West at all. Simple things like rolling over Yugoslavia's debt proved to be impossible, no interest. It was almost inane, the response from Europe, except Europe didn't want to save Yugoslavia as a country, first of all, and it was already into very particular, this one's on our side, this one's not on our side, and we were beginning to see a very different mentality. I didn't understand that at the time. I just thought they were idiots, frankly, the European side, unresponsive, understanding of a hyperinflation. And what I had learned from Keynes as a practicing economist, and what I believe to this day, is don't let a crisis just fester, because it will turn into a disaster. You actively try to cure things. You don't just let things take their natural course, because natural courses end up in war. They don't end up in solutions. You have to work for solutions. So then I was asked by Mr. Yeltsin, first by Mr. Gorbachev, who I was happy to try to help. And that failed miserably when a group of us suggested to Mr. Gorbachev to appeal to the West for emergency financial support. And there was no interest at all at the G8 summit in 1991. And when Gorbachev left the G8 summit, the putsch in August 91 took place, in part because they said, this guy's got nothing. He's, a failure. He can't bring any help to this country. Disaster. 3 months later, Mr. Yeltsin called me. Actually, Mr. Gaidar called me and asked me to help. And I had a lot of experience about financial stabilization at that point, and I wrote up the kinds of things that should be done. And you'll see why this is relevant in just a moment. And they are basic things: a standstill on debt servicing, emergency financial lines, some help with canceling unpayable debts. These are standard solutions for a deep financial crisis. I proposed, as in Poland, a stabilization fund for the ruble. In other words, back the currency. Not one of those things was accepted. Complete smackdown, 100%. Not one of them. I've been blamed for many things for 25 years afterwards, which are absurd, because it wasn't about economics, it was about politics. The West, and especially Washington, was just not interested in helping Russia, period. Russia was on the other side of the divide, mentally. This is something that I failed to appreciate and absolutely could not embody in my own imagination. For me, 1992 was a glorious moment of history, a chance for democracy, a chance for unification, a chance for ending Cold War divisions, a chance for creating a new prosperity. I couldn't imagine that Mr. Cheney, who was then Defense Secretary, and his deputy Wolfowitz and others were dreaming up the new American century and dreaming up how to maintain American unipolarity. But they were. And somebody explained it to me, actually. A senior US official said to me, Jeff, I want you to understand, even if your economics is right, and I'm not saying I disagree with you, you're not going to get any of these requests met. You're just not. Understand it. My problem is I can't hear no very well. Because many times I hear no and it turns into yes, so I never know when no is real or when it's just slowness on the other side. And so I didn't believe this man. He happened to be acting Secretary of State at the time. He knew something about US policy, but he was basically telling me the economics was right, but the politics was wrong. That's what I couldn't dream. I couldn't dream that we wouldn't take this wonderful opportunity to help Russia through a very intense financial crisis, to help it get it back on its feet, and to help create a more unified geopolitical world that didn't have divides in it. Well, nothing like that happened. And Russia went into a very deep financial crisis, not only because of this, because the whole buildup of the Soviet collapse was a mega collapse of a mega wrong economic approach for decades. Let's be clear about that. But there was no help at all from the West. And the Russian crisis was deep, and then the Russian state was completely pillaged by corruption, massive, massive corruption. And when Putin came to power, he could not look at the US in very friendly terms, frankly, because this had been stupid behavior by the United States over this period. Thoughtless, cynical, not designed to solve problems. Not as bad as 1919, but nothing like the enlightened approach that could have cemented a solid relationship. It was a way to create doubt, a way to create animosity, a way to say the US is in charge and we don't care. And I think this is incredibly short-sighted. And I observe this front and center. Here, to some extent, although I couldn't put the pieces together very well, as I said, I just thought it was stupid politics, but it was geopolitics. And in Russia, it was really geopolitics. And in a way, we're living on that legacy. I don't want to absolve the Russian government of what I regard as absolutely unlawful actions in recent months. But the prelude to it was that we lost an opportunity historically that would have made a very big difference by having a magnanimity in 1989, 1991. There was no magnanimity at all. There was just short-sightedness. I can't even tell you, by the way. I mean, I can tell you, but I don't have time to tell you. I went to the IMF and said completely sensible things, knowledgeable things, experienced things, things that have been proven in Poland 2 years earlier. And the deputy managing director just looked at me and said, no. And I said, why? No. Why? Well, you know why he was saying no. He was saying no because the US government told him to say no. Why wasn't he explaining it? Because he couldn't explain it. Because he was just a pawn of the US government at the time. His assignment was to say no. Okay, this is not how we solve world problems. So that's a backdrop to the feelings of recreating divides. And it surprised me that Europe too, Europe made it, maybe for technocratic reasons to some extent, this enormous hurdle to get into the European Union. And that created the divide. You're in, you're on this side, you're on the other side. Russia, of course, no way. We'll talk to you, but the real members are here. And when NATO followed EU membership, it just absolutely just shifted the barrier. This was not thinking. This really was not thinking, and it especially did not create the conditions for a different kind of approach that really could have been the more unified world that we need. Because not only as an economist would I say that these boundaries are dumb, but I would say they're dangerous. They're dangerous in exactly the way we see them, as we see them becoming dangerous right now. When you have sharp boundaries, then the whole question is, which side are you on? Can Ukraine be pried out of Russia's hands into Europe's hands? This is an absurd question. Look at a map. Ukraine can't be pried anywhere. Ukraine is where it is. And it happens to be next to Russia on one side and next to Europe on another side. It's not a matter of prying it out. And look at where Russia is. Russia is the main part of Russia's population is in Europe. And the main part of Russia's economy, other than some of the oil and gas reserves, are in Europe. And by the way, Russia cannot succeed economically without good relations with Europe. When I went to Moscow in January and participated in a very good forum with senior government officials, I felt the situation economically was pretty good, actually, and that the economy was being pretty well managed. But I thought that what was missing was stronger connections between Russian industry and especially German industry to modernize Russian industry in aeronautics, in automobiles, in information technology, because Russia is operating on 1.5 engines right now. One is, of course, the petroeconomy, and the half engine is manufacturing, which isn't quite internationally competitive, but could be. But for that, it needs strong technological connections with Germany above all, with Europe more generally, and with the world, not to be closed. So I left Moscow just before the Olympics feeling pretty good. Just one more step, and we're going to have a way finally to get the economy properly set. Well, you may say that's just my naivete, and there is naivete in it because I'm always hoping for the better. I'm not making forecasts. I'm trying to aim for the better outcome. And then everything was downhill from then on. And I do believe that both sides of this, though I hate to think of them as sides, but of course it's both sides, have responsibility for what's happened. Europe and the United States acted provocatively, I do believe, and pushed in certain ways. So did Russia. I do believe that Russia has international legal responsibilities to the territorial integrity of Ukraine, which it has violated, and which I think is a very serious violation. There's quite a solemn commitment made in 1994, in addition to the normal international law, which says that in return of the nuclear weapons from Ukraine, Russia commits to guaranteeing the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And this is fundamental. How are we ever going to get nuclear weapons under control, as Nina said, if we don't honor such commitments in such contexts? So I'm not happy with what's happened. I understand it. But I'm not at all happy or relieved by these tensions. I find them extremely, extremely serious and very dangerous, actually. The truth is that none of the big powers right now is respecting international law. And this is the big danger for the whole world. Certainly a big danger for all small countries, but it's actually a big danger for all countries. We can't just choose international law when we want to. I was completely on the Russian and Chinese side, if I may say so, during the debate over Syria. Because to my mind, when the U.S. says Assad must go, that's a violation of international law. I don't like any country saying some other leader must go. We can't have a world like that, where some power dictates who runs another country, much less when that leader doesn't go, that we funnel arms or logistics or money to a rebellion. That's completely in violation of international law. And it continues to this day. And President Obama reconfirmed U.S. Syrian policy just in his speech at West Point a few days ago. And then he proclaimed U.S. commitment to international law. That's a kind of blindness. That is American hubris. It's not really acceptable. It's extremely dangerous. And I completely sided, by the way, with Russia when Russia and China complained about the Libya operation. You know, that really was a case, convince Gaddafi to give up his nuclear and other ambitions and then kill him, because they got tired of him. We can't go on actually like this. Every local rebellion, you say, okay, we support you because so-and-so must go, and then send in NATO planes. That's not acceptable. And so I found myself very much on Russia's side on these arguments, but not on Ukraine, because it's the same behavior the other direction, it seems to me. It's no more justified. There's territorial integrity. There's a national commitment. So I don't take sides on these issues. I'm on the side trying, naively as it is, to come to the defense of two propositions. One is that we shouldn't draw artificial economic lines. We should try to make a global world economy, because that's going to be the best hope for everybody. And second, that we should honor international law and stop playing games when it's to our convenience or not to our convenience. And not to say, as President Obama did a few days ago, I believe to the core American exceptionalism. Then he said, because we're exceptional and that we defend international law. Well, not quite. Because if you listen to American presidents, all of them, they say we will always choose our own, not what the UN tells us to do. That's not international law. International law says that except for self-defense, you have to have a Security Council resolution. You don't get to choose. That's our hope for peace. That is the difference of 1914 and what we hope for today. So these are reasons why I regard the Ukraine crisis as very serious, and why I really hope that what we're seeing right now is some cooling off now that the presidential election has taken place. An experienced, seasoned Ukrainian politician has been elected president. I think he's making the right statements about seeking a peaceful working relationship with Russia. This strikes me as extremely sensible and correct. And what I do know, again, and I'll close here, speaking with an economist's hat on one more time, Russia cannot gain by this in any way. It's actually not even the case that it's testing whether Germany will or won't follow through on sanctions. That's too superficial a way to understand the dynamics of this. If Ukraine is destabilized, if there were to be a border crossing of Russian troops into eastern Ukraine under any pretext, it doesn't matter right now what the leaders think about sanctions. The breakdown of economic relations will be extraordinary. And Russia's prosperity depends not on signing another deal with China, though that's fine, not on the Eurasian Union, whatever. It depends on Russia being part of the world economy. And it depends on Russia being well integrated with high technology world, not with low technology neighbors, but with a high technology world, because that's Russia's hope for reaching the prosperity that it seeks. And so that's why I hope this crisis is on its waning days now, because it's an extremely dangerous one for all of us, and it's extremely dangerous for Russia as well. Thanks.
Zannier, you had a very powerful international organization. So that's why I want to ask you for your opinion on the support for unilateral Kosovo declaration of independence. Does this support leave the Western countries open to charges of hypocrisy in regard to Crimea?
Well, it seems to me, first of all, if you don't mind, I would like to start just to come backwards on one point which has been raised at least by two of the speakers here, which is Europe history and maps. It is very true that we have lots of history here in Europe. One of the things I learned when I was operating here in this region was the history of the region, but I learned parallel histories of the region. So everybody has his own interpretation of what happened in the past and uses it to justify an interpretation of what should happen in future. So that's very dangerous. Maps are very dangerous. So I would encourage everybody to keep a safe distance from that when looking at the way ahead. You mentioned Crimea. First time I went to Crimea, I was staying in a hotel that, as they explained to me, used to be a Genoan fortress, and they told me there were a number of Genoan colonies there. I saw remains of Hellenic presence. I spoke to some leaders of the Tatar community who told me stories that were very different from what the Ukrainians were telling me about Crimea. And I'm not entering into the Russian narrative of this. So this also explains that basing your calls on simply on what your interpretation is of what happened may be very misleading and may complicate your way forward. international law and the rules, and I think I would like to come back to what Professor Sachs was saying. I think that must be the way forward. We need rules. We need to stick to the rules. Also, there are obviously different ways of interpreting the rules. There are political also ways through negotiation to adjust the rules, but in ways that are in a way reflecting consent of all. So this also can be done. There are possibilities for flexibility. There are also processes. There are Security Council decisions, etc. So we have a number of parameters, and I think sticking to those parameters as much as possible is also a safe way to proceed. I think the Memorandum of '94 was mentioned. To me, that was an important anchor, in a way, in terms of ensuring sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. The fact that it has been violated may have consequences in the future. Once again, justifying minority rights, justifying history as a basis for changes may unravel, in a way, the map of Europe as we know it. So we need to tread very carefully on that. You mentioned Kosovo, of course, and I will come to that too. On Kosovo, we saw an alignment of how can I say, legal and political attitudes. There was a negotiation. There were different interpretations on how that negotiation was concluded. There were facts on the ground, and at some point there were sort of parallel realities developing. The challenge for the international community was to try to keep those realities as much as possible in line in a how can I say, in a context where actors, international actors that have different visions and different interpretations of the facts on the ground could find an angle that would not prejudge their position in principle vis-à-vis the condition and what was happening in the territory. It seems to me that over time, political processes such as the progress of the region in general towards a process of integration, the European integration, contributed to solving a number of practical issues that may have over time also implication on the larger political question. So it seems to me a pragmatic approach focusing on solving issues that are factual issues, but related also to interpretation of a legal situation, may over time allow to come to a solution that will align the international community. It is a difficult, a complicated path, of course. It seems to me we as the international community started moving in the right direction. There's still quite a way to go. So that is perhaps my understanding, and we are part of the facilitating element in all this. But even the role of a facilitator is not an easy one, because obviously this is seen in very different ways from those who want lots of facilitation and those who don't feel a need for any facilitation. So even that is complicated.
Well, this is exactly why I'm asking you, because, okay, let's say we have a regional, granted one regional power, one major global power, and they have their different interpretations, not only of history, but also of legal norms. So could you give me your interpretation? At least, are we wrong? I mean, are we right when we think that it appears as if these two rival powers have taken totally opposite legal points of view on Kosovo and Crimea? What the Americans were saying 10 years ago about Kosovo, the Russians are now saying about Crimea, and vice versa. Is this a misinterpretation, or does this strike you as?
You see, I sit in an organization where I represent all of them, so it is very difficult for me to give you an answer to this question. But let me say once again, I think the solution is looking ahead, looking in the direction in which you should try to move. And also there, I think something that we are increasingly putting on the agenda, on our own political agenda, whether the OSCE has any role in this is beside the point. It seems to me that we need, and now back to the Ukraine issue, we need to create an environment where the two spaces that we see building should increasingly interact with each other, not only economically but also politically. We need, ideally, a kind of integration of the integrations, and this engagement has to be the one that produces the results. This would allow also to create a political space within which then the Ukrainians can find a solution to their own problems. I don't think anybody outside should determine where Ukraine should go and what the key strategic choices of the Ukrainian people should be. It's for them really to make that decision. Obviously, they are where they are, as it was said, and so they have to take into account the political realities. In a way, this applies also to this part of the world.
Well, Professor Narochnitskaya, let me ask you something else. Many people in our region...
Could you speak a little bit louder into the mic?
Yes, I'm sorry. So many people in our region see parallels between the Ukraine conflict and the Balkan Wars of the 90s. And one speculation goes that if Russia had been less weak in the 90s, it all might have turned out differently, and that the disintegration of Yugoslavia might have even been less chaotic. This implies that there's a silver lining in a Cold War situation, which was missing. But does this assumption have any credibility? And I will later ask the others as well.
You are absolutely right in posing such questions about similarities. I'm the one who notices the similarities practically everywhere, and with the Second World War, in the period of First World War, and with the 19th century. For instance, when I was reading shortly before declassified tete-a-tete conversations between Mr. Bevin and Mr. Molotov in 1945 about the plight of Italian colonies and Dodecanese Islands. When I was reading, I thought that by mistake May gave the folder of Berlin Congress of 1878, because they were something like between, for instance, Gorchakov and Disraeli or Salisbury. No fight between totalitarianism and democracy, just Eastern question in its purity. Generalissimo Stalin promised Churchill once that he would not move into Mediterranean. Why are you asking to turn Tripolitania as trust territory with a base for your commercial fleet, Bevin says. For instance, the similarities are great, and of course, if Soviet Union, if Russia in the 90s was Russia of today's, that wouldn't have happened to Yugoslavia, or at least it would not happen so painful in such dramatic ways, with Serbs being a divided nation again after 150 years of their fight for independence since the first Serbian Ustanku. But with Serbs, we are never at the same stage of enduring and standing. When Russia is surveilling, Serbs are fighting. When Serbs are quite, tolerant to any pressure from the West, we are starting feeling with independent voice. So there is no resonance. Okay, I quite agree with my distinguished ambassador to my right that we must always look for the future. Past is needed to distinguish what in the present events is just a very new, only produced by absolutely new circumstances? Or is it just the revelation of continuous and hereditary aspirations? If you look, for instance, at the pressure arrows, like sometimes on computer, on maps it is shown with regard to Russia from the West to today, you will see that all is done for Russia to withdraw it from both Baltics and Black Sea region to the northeast of Eurasia, where the depth of freezing is about 2 meters around Moscow region, and the distance between centers of production and centers of consumption are over 1,000 kilometers, so it makes it very non-competitive. The same was in the 19th century, because all the Russo-Turkish wars with engagement of very interested engagement of other great powers who dictated the peace treaty always to abide Russian victory was the same, so that Russia doesn't acquire more influence on Balkan Peninsula, and because, for instance, for Britain, before World War I, that would mean that all Catholic Slavs would be oriented on Germany, and most Orthodox would, with, of course, some games on the part of the elites, would be not far from Russian orbits. That was Britain's policy towards Greece, and that was the policy to fragmentize and not allow on Balkan, with inevitable collapse of Ottoman Empire, to the emergence of mono-ethnic and mono-religious, bigger and more competitive new states. And for instance, the ideas of Greater Serbia since Načrtanje of Ilya Garashanin is a nightmare for Western powers, but the process of collecting all ethnically close lands was a natural process of any European nations already in the past of every national history, in France's, British, others, etc., and with much more blood. Also, all the borders are written by blood in history, let us be honest. So it's also the same. Then other similarities. What we now see so flourishing in Ukraine, this Russophobic Galician philosophy that was already on the banner of the post-communist Ukraine, why? We are too close to nations. It's the brotherly relationship. This is not a fantasy, but it's a very complex phenomenon in mentality. It's a complex of togetherness, but also of rivalry and competition, etc. The first crime committed on earth by a human being, it was fratricide. Cain killed Abel only because of jealousy. I'm reading now that Ukraine, if not for Russians who grew so rapidly because of their barbarian aggressiveness, they, Ukrainians, could have become what Russia is now. And that I was reading in the 19th century books, especially by Polish provincial historian Franciszek Duchiński, who even professed that it was his original idea that we are not, Russians and Muscovites, I'm also, not being Slavs at all. We are Mongols or Tatars, etc. So today it's not politically correct even to invoke such paradigms of thinking, especially for Russians who have never been racist. Otherwise, we wouldn't have built such a state. Even pre-Christian Russian prince had an international in his warriors, etc. But everyone was accepted. So we had never been. We are used to live with next to you different people and respect them to be different. We have in our territory deserts and permafrost. Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox, Jews, Muslims with patriarchal ways in Caucasus and pantheists. So we have this ability to respect the multi-diversity of the world, which Americans, I doubt, have. And another thing, what is also similar with the situation in Ukraine, in what is now Ukraine 100 years ago. If you read, for instance, Wikipedia, you will learn that grandfather of Mr. Tagnibok, member of Rada and leader of extremely nationalist, pro-fascist party Svoboda, although of course he is not as Dmitry Yarosh, leader of the so-called right sector. His grandfather was even mentioned on Versailles conference as someone guilty, Longin Zygielski, guilty to report for Austro-Habsburg authorities of some Orthodox Ukrainians sympathizing with Russia, and they were sentenced and sent to the concentration camp near Graz, Talerhof. And read also in internet Talerhof Almanac. You will have the enormous pile of documents on the crimes of Galician anti-Moscovites during the First World War, when the Russian army first was there, then withdrew, etc. I was reading the memoirs or the papers of appointed governor of Lvov in 1916. He said all locals should be divided or qualified as two groups: Hochverräters, high traitors, Russophiles means, and Ukrainians. They might become good Österreicher. What is, by the way, for Professor Christopher Clark also, what is similar to, if you compare the map of NATO expansion now with the map of pan-Germanists that was circulated during the World War I, you will practically see no difference, absolutely. What the Germans, with their unabated ambitions, could not achieve in two major Drang nach Osten during 20th century, everything was fulfilled by the Anglo-Saxons with the help of international institutions, etc. And about the guilt of Kaiser Germany, 25 years before the war, you can read it in the Geheime Papiere von Holstein. The future Chancellor von Bülow writes, in the future war with Russia, we must, first of all, to force Russia off far off of two coasts that have made Russia great power, that is the Baltics and the Black Sea. So the aged, absolutely just before his death, Bismarck left on the margin his remark, such extravagant designs should not leave traces on paper. So nothing changes under the world. Russia always can restore her status of great power, if not forced completely from the Black Sea of the Baltics. That also explains Zbigniew Brzezinski's this today's enfant terrible of political science in America. He has voices everything which is in the mind of wiser decision makers, that he immediately said it's not Soviet Union that collapsed in 1991, it's my hated Russian Empire, and without Ukraine it will never regain this status. With everything else, with Tajiks, etc., but with Ukraine, without anything else, it will again be great power. So that also explains such pampering by Democrats of Ukrainian clan leaders and perfect Democrats as Saakashvili. Of course, who would care for Saakashvili if not the location of Georgia on Black Sea coast, etc. If it were somewhere in the near North Pole, who would even made out of him the shop window of democracy in the Black Sea? It's an Eastern question. It's the same as in 19th century. I think it's so natural. And actually the essence of Munich speech of our president, there was nothing political scientists haven't already written. He just deprived the West and the United States from the right to impose the role of speaker for the phantom of international civilized community. That's it. And by the way, my distinguished counterpart, Professor Khrushcheva, mentioned the breaches of international law. Who started it, my ladies and gentlemen? The collapse of Soviet Union. If you read the dissertations of many law professors in the world, was absolutely illegal because there is no right to dissolve a union. There is right to leave it for a republic, first of all. Then the bombing of Yugoslavia, which I experienced here, having come through Bulgarian mountains out of solidarity to stand on the bridge with my Serbian brothers, that was the burial of the world order based on sovereignty, which cannot be qualified as second-rate or first-rate, depending on the level of civilization or democracy. Since our dear chief of today's conference, Mr. Vuk Remich, you were UN high official, do you remember chapter 1 of United Nations Charter, Purposes and Principles? We have learned it by heart at the Institute as beginning of the political English translation course. It mentions no democracy at all. It states sovereign equality of all different and various systems of values in the world. That means that from the point of view of international law and UN Charter, a monarchy, a religious state, be it Hindu, Muslim, Christian, and secular libertarian as the Western one, are absolutely equal, and there is no relation between them as between higher and more progressive or etc. So when these humanitarian retaliations and interventions started, that was just at the end of the post-Westphalian international law concept taught in every university before. So, what was with Ossetia, with Abkhazia? Their rights were suspended because Georgia broke the law of cession, new Gorbachevian law of April 1990. It said that if a republic of the Soviet Union wants to leave, and it has autonomous entities on this, every entity should be given right of separate referendum and can have the right of option whether to go together with the one who declares the desire or to be left. Georgia lost control over the territory exactly over that issue. And it was recognized by the West, despite of that fact. And the West declared the conflict between Ossetia and Abkhazia as separatist, as if it started on the territory of long ago established immaculate legal state. So who started international law breaches?
Professor, your audience is spellbound.
Yes.
But it will destroy my journalistic credibility since you are the one powerful politician on this panel if I let you speak longer than the others. But thank you very much.
I'm sorry.
Professor Khrushcheva.
Okay. All right. Here I am. Poor little Russia, boo-hoo, is always a victim. Somebody's always out to get it. So it always has to fight back through force because it cannot do anything else differently. So this is sort of general comment. As for the international institutions, the collapse of the Soviet Union, by the way, I did mention the word Yeltsin, and he was the one who collapsed the Soviet Union. I do understand that it's always very, America is such an easy target. I mean, there's always America to blame for all sorts of things. America did not collapse the Soviet Union. It did bring certain ideas into people's minds, and unfortunately, they couldn't develop them rightly. I can't believe that I'm disagreeing with Jeffrey Sachs, the great Jeffrey Sachs, but I am disagreeing with Jeffrey Sachs. Please forgive me. Just when you said that it was a wonderful opportunity for Russia to change and U.S. didn't help. And, you know, I actually don't blame them because they didn't believe Russia could reform. And, in fact, Russia didn't reform, and it couldn't reform. Democracy, and on this I will end because there's many more things I want to say, but I'm just going to stop there. Democracy is a very hard choice. But it is a choice. It's not somebody who's going to come and do it for you or decide it for you and fix it for you. It's a hard choice of any individual in any free country. So nobody comes as a savior. And I think one of the problems that we do face in our part of the world, we're always looking for a savior. And if the savior doesn't come, we blame somebody who did not deliver or we think did not deliver.
Thank you, but let me just ask you one more thing, because you said it was probably not a new Cold War. And yes, Professor Sachs said that Europe did not want to save Yugoslavia and that the U.S. did not want to help Russia. So what is it that's lacking? Is it only because Russia doesn't have a pact? Yes.
Well, I think part of it is certainly, I mean, the Cold War was two political and economic systems that were trying to prove to the world that they're better than each other. And by the way, to your question that if Russia was stronger in the 90s, would Serbia or Yugoslavia had a different fate? Probably, but Russia couldn't have been. You know, I'm not a blamer of anybody, but Russia couldn't have been because for 75 years it has promised humanity that it's going to bring great salvation to everybody. It's going to bring universal justice, and it didn't deliver. For that, it could not have been strong in the 90s, just because on its ideological, political, philosophical promise, it did not deliver. So that could not have happened, and we cannot even discuss whether it could or could not, because history doesn't know conditional tenses. It really is not. So as for the Cold War, the reason I object to that term, because when you use old terms, I mean, for example, people have been throwing fascism around, and I find it very wrong just because that makes us very lazy. We're not thinking of new concepts. If we consider the New World Order, we have to define what the New World Order is. Because once we start talking about the Cold War, we're once again going back to history. And yes, history is very important, but once we're looking at all the answers in history, then we barely have a present and absolutely devoid ourselves of any future. So what I'm encouraging is that let's look for somebody like George Kennan who would design a new language to discuss this kind of conflict. And when we do, maybe we'd have better diplomacy, better solutions, better policies.
But in the meantime, your sense is that, what I get from you is that America's biggest mistake is hubris, triumphalism, but that's it.
Well, no, I mean, America has, look.
No, I mean in this conflict.
Right,
in this
conflict,
does
there's
NATO
many
expansion have something to do with the problem?
Unfortunately, I mean, America has a lot of mistakes, and that let's, go into history. But America's big mistake is hubris, because America does think is better than anybody else, and sort of decides what it can do. It can do, but somebody else cannot. But at the same time, something that Jeff was saying was completely correct, is that Russia, regional power or not, Russia is part of American foreign policy. From the Russian discourse, it seems that the only thing we have is the United States. I mean, it's that America is there and it's always out to get us. So that immediately makes us very different in terms of, so if you are a world power, you actually deal with other instances and not having one supposed enemy as the most important enemy. So no, America has a lot of problems. That's not what I was saying, but I was saying that I can see how others could react to the United States hubris and double-speak that often uses. But I also, as I said, I do believe that the American formula of progress actually is not a bad formula, or so far nobody has offered us a better one. And certainly Putin has not offered me a better formula. That's all I was saying. So America has a lot of issues.
Professor Sachs, it's your turn, but when you respond, I would also like you to touch upon this Serbia's position now on Ukraine. Serbia's position is not to take a position. Is it, since you like to talk about the future and what is going to happen, is this tenable? Is Serbia's present position on Ukraine something that it's going to be able to live with?
Well, I think Serbia's present position is prudent and also compatible with its coming role in the OSCE, just to try to be constructive but not to take a side in this. And I think that that's clearly what the government is doing, and it seems completely appropriate to me. I did want to answer Nina in one regard, which is that you never know whether taking the option of hoping for the best will work or not. But in general in life, it's better to try that than to presume the failure. And so I think that I'm happy to go through life naively optimistic, because there's a functional approach to that, which is that once in a while you're right and you actually get a good outcome. You surprise a lot of people. Of course you're disappointed. Life is filled with disappointments, but better to be disappointed after having tried the right thing than to be confirmed in your disappointment for not having tried. And I can only tell you, I'll tell you a story that may seem a little bit peculiar also. When Poland first made this transition in 1989, I wrote this plan, and I put forward these ideas that, as I said, were ultimately accepted. But at the first moment, the IMF technical team rejected all of them, and I had a kind of showdown with them in a hotel in Warsaw. And they said, these are the same people as 6 months ago. Nothing's really changed here. Why would you give help to these people? They're the same people that cheated before and defaulted before. And it was a cynical senior bureaucrat, by the way, very nice man. But no, really a very nice man, but basically just doing the normal thing. And I looked at him in disbelief. I said, are you kidding? You're in charge of a region that's just had the biggest geopolitical change in 50 years, and you're saying nothing's changed? Are you kidding? You're not going to try? And believe me, if you don't try, I'm going to blast the hell out of you for failure to try. Not that that makes so much of a difference, but it gives me a little bit of opportunity to release steam. And they ended up, the U.S. had a different point of view and ended up following the ideas of actually doing something. So you may be right. You may be completely right, substantively, that there could not have been a big reform early on, that it wasn't ready. Russia was as difficult and confused as any place I've ever worked in my whole life, which is more than 100 countries. In 1992, it was a terribly difficult circumstance. And of course, I'm no expert in any of this. I'm the worst thing possible. I'm an economist that does not know all of the details, the history, the intricacies of local politics, and so forth. But I do believe that the stance of hope, rather than the stance of resignation or feeling that things must go on, is generally the right approach to take, because life sometimes surprises in a very positive way. And I think we didn't act with hope. I think we acted with maybe realism,
prejudice,
maybe
true.
Prejudice, maybe cynicism, because Mr. Cheney's one of the most cynical people that we've ever had in public life in the United States. And that's a serious comment, not just he got us into a disaster globally. And I think that this kind of cynicism is the big danger. And when you look at the history of World War I, which is what has brought us here, we fall into World War I because in the end, every actor took the worst scenario of the counterpart. And this is what leads to disaster in the end. And in that book, which you kindly mentioned, when your grandfather and President Kennedy made peace in 1963, it was precisely because each of them reached beyond their own advisors, who would have killed the world 1,000,000 times over. And they actually both said, I can do something with my counterpart. They're human beings. That was a very unusual position to take, by the way. That's why I love that speech of President Kennedy, which I quoted last night. And for those of you who were at the dinner, and for those not, it was a speech on peace that he gave. And it was a unique speech from the point of view of an American president, because the whole speech in 1963, it's unbelievable. Rather than telling the Soviet Union what to do, the whole speech is directed to the American people to urge them to reconsider America's attitudes, because his whole speech is saying the Soviet people are human beings. They want the same things we do. They're not irrational. They're not crazy. Our job is not to humiliate them. They are our counterparts, and our common interests absolutely exceed our divisions. And that was his whole point, to tell Americans, have confidence, we're dealing with human beings on the other side. So I really do think that this is, I mean, it's a stance. It's my ideological stance. Always aim for the best. And if you lose a little money in the process, it's only money in the end. Because I'm never doing anything more than saying put money into it. Because I believe that adding some resources can ease tensions, help people to survive, lower the temperature, create a sense of stability. I'm terrified of mobs, basically. I'm terrified of things running out of control. I'm terrified of panics. I'm terrified of self-fulfilling prophecies of downward spiral of hate, because all of those things we know are well within the human condition and are absolutely rational from the point of view of any individual actor at any moment, but produce completely disastrous, irrational results. So I'm always in favor of trying the best. And if you fail, okay, what have you done, except you've lost a little money along the way, but at least you will have, on the positive side, laid down a marker that says, I tried, rather than I was too doubtful to try, never trusted you from the beginning. And that is generally my motivation, just to explain that.
I am now going to aim for the best, and I know we could go another round, but I would like to suggest that Vuk Jeremić perhaps wrap this up And I'm sure he's ready, although we never rehearsed this line.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Smajlović, and you'd be surprised. I find myself too humbled after a discussion like this, and after the discussions that we've had over the past few days to wrap it up, because we've heard from so many true experts and beautiful minds and real voices of authority in their respective fields on a number of issues that have been leading humanity over the past 100 years over this historical trajectory, which did indeed, in some ways, start, at least physically, in this part of the world, which makes the 1914, which makes the centenary very important for this region, and important for this country in particular. And therefore, we are really grateful, and myself and the people that I work with at the Center for International Relations and Sustainable Development in particular, to all of you for having attended this conference, and in particular to those who have kindly accepted the invitation to participate. And over these 2 days, we've heard from truly renowned and exceptional historians. We heard from distinguished professors. We were listening from the senior experienced policymakers, some sitting, some former. But I think at least this was, for me, the case. It was an amazing opportunity to learn and to reflect and to try and understand how we got to here with the hope of having a clearer picture and a clearer vision as to where to go next. As Serbia, as the region, but as the international community as a whole. So Jeff was my professor at Harvard, so this thing that he had mentioned, aiming for the best, is not the first time that I'm hearing from him. Well, we did try to aim for the best in this conference. I hope we had at least partially succeeded. When it comes to the choice of discussant, I think one can argue very strongly that we've at least almost made it there. I want to thank you for your bearing with us over these 2 days. I'm very happy that I'm seeing so many young people here in the audience. This is the closing of our conference. What I can promise is that there are going to be many more events like this in the coming months and years in the organization of the Center for International Relations and Sustainable Development. Thank you very much.
America is always great. It's such an easy time.